right, welcome back to our podcast. I'm the gentleman, accompanied by the disturbed Southern Belle.
Hello.
And in this episode, we will be continuing our series on the more interesting conspiracy theories, continuing with part 2 of the moon landing conspiracy. So, we left off with the photo and video abnormalities that were used to try to prove that the moon landing and the subsequent missions were a hoax. We're picking up now with the next theory regarding the hoax, which is the missing data argument. So these arguments claim that blueprints, design, development drawings of the machines involved have gone missing. Also, Apollo 11 data tapes are missing, and these are supposed to contain telemetry and high-quality video before scan conversion from the slow scan TV to standard TV of the first moonwalk.
Right.
Dr. David Williams, a NASA archivist at Goddard Space Flight Center and Apollo 11 flight director Eugene K. Kranz, have both acknowledged that the original high-quality Apollo 11 telemetry data tapes are missing. Conspiracy theorists claim that this is evidence that they never even existed. The Apollo 11 telemetry tapes were different than the other tapes of the moon landings because they contained the raw TV broadcast. For technical reasons, the Apollo 11 lander carried a slow-scan TV camera known as an SSTV. To broadcast the pictures to regular TV, a scan conversion had to be done. The radio telescope at Parkes Observatory in Australia was able to receive the telemetry from the moon at the time of the Apollo 11 moonwalk.
Right.
Parkes had a bigger antenna than NASA's antenna at Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station. Thus, it received a better picture.
Well, that would make sense.
The tapes were claimed to have been sent for storage at the U.S. National Archives in 1970, but by 1984, all of the Apollo 11 tapes had been returned to the Goddard Space Flight Center at their request. In November of 2006, Cosmos Online reported that about 100 data tapes recorded in Australia during the Apollo 11 mission had been found in a small marine science laboratory in the main physics building at Curtin University of Technology in Perth, Australia. In July of 2009, NASA indicated that it must have erased the original Apollo 11 moon footage years ago so that it could reuse the tape. Senior engineer Richard Navsger was in charge of the live TV recordings during the Apollo missions. He was also put in charge of the restoration project. After a 3-year search, the conclusion was made that about 45 tapes of the Apollo 11 video were erased and reused. Lowry Digital had been tasked with restoring the surviving footage of the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. Lowry Digital president Mike Inchlik stated that the footage was by far and away the lowest quality video that the company had ever dealt with, which is kind of impressive in its own right.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that it would probably not be great
Oh, yeah.
quality anyway, but yeah.
Just kind of impressive that would have been the least or the lowest quality that they'd ever seen.
Exactly. It is.
The restoration project took months to complete and did not include sound quality improvements. Most of the blueprints for the lunar module appear to have been destroyed, but copies of the blueprints for the Saturn V exist in microfilm. Next, we'll discuss NASA technology compared to the USSR. So, conspiracist Bart Sibrel cites the relative level of the US and USSR space technology as evidence that the moon landings could not have happened. He states that for much of the early stages of the space race, the USSR was ahead of the US. However, the USSR was not able to fly a crewed spacecraft to the moon. Thus, it's argued that if the USSR could not do this, the US should have been unable to develop the technology to do so.
Right.
An example of this was made by Sibrel, in which he claims that during the Apollo program, the USSR had 5 times more crewed hours in space than the US. He also notes that the USSR was first to achieve many early milestones in space. These include the first artificial satellite, the first living creature in orbit, the first man in orbit, the first woman in space, and the first spacewalk. However, most of the Soviet gains were matched by the US within a year, some within weeks. Furthermore, NASA and others claim that the gains made by the Soviets are not as impressive as they may seem. They claim that most of these firsts were mere stunts that did little to advance their technology, if any at all.
Right. It was basically they were saying they were doing the same thing over and over again, so
Yeah,
it wasn't really anything new.
pretty much. So, at the time of the launch of the first crewed Earth orbiting Apollo flight, which was Apollo 7, the USSR had only made 9 space flights, 7 with one cosmonaut, 1 with 2, and 1 with 3. The US had made 16. Also, in terms of spacecraft hours, the USSR had 460, while the US had about 1,024.
So a lot more.
Many much more. So, in terms of astronaut cosmonaut time, the USSR had 534 hours of crewed spaceflight, while the US had 1,992.
So again, a lot more.
Much more. Also, the USSR did not develop a successful rocket capable of crewed lunar missions until 1980s. Their N-1 rocket failed on all 4 attempts between 1969 and 1972. Now, to talk about the technology that was used by NASA, digital tech was in its infancy during the time of the moon landings. The astronauts had relied on computers to aid the moon missions. The Apollo guidance computer was on the lunar module, and the command and service module.
Right.
Most computers at the time were very large and had poor overall specs. For example, the Xerox Alto, which was released in 1973, was a year after the final moon landing. This computer only had 96 kilobytes of memory.
Good grief. Can you imagine compared to what we have now? I mean,
Yeah.
we're in terabytes and everything, easily.
Actually, I think we're above terabytes
We
now.
are, but I mean, most just regular computers you get
Yeah.
are like at least 500 to 500 gigabytes on the low end on most, for
Yeah,
memory. So that's crazy when you think about it. And they're as big as a room, some of them.
yeah,
I mean, it's nuts.
it really is crazy. Just
It
looking
is.
back at old photos
It
of what things
is.
used to be.
It absolutely is.
But moving on, conspiracists claim that computers at the time of the missions would not have been advanced enough to enable space travel to the moon and back. They also claim that radio transmissions, radar, and other instrumentation were also inefficient or insufficient.
Right.
Another theory points to the deaths of NASA personnel after the Apollo missions. In a TV program about the moon landing hoax, a list of deaths was given that was supposedly related to the crew spaceflight program as part of the alleged cover-up. So I'm going to go over some of them.
Right.
So one was Theodore Freeman, who was killed while ejecting from a T-38 in October of 1964. Another was Elliot C. and Charles Bassett also died in a T-38 crash in February of 1966. Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaff, I'm not sure about that one, were killed in a fire during the Plugs Out test preceding Apollo 1 in January of 1967. Edward Givens was killed in a car accident in June 1967. Michael J. Adams died in an X-15 crash in November of 1967. He was also the only pilot killed during the X-15 flight test program. He was a test pilot, not a NASA astronaut, but had flown the X-15 above 80 kilometers or 50 miles.
Good God, that is high to go,
Yes, that
so
is very high.
we don't think about how high that is. That's woo.
Yeah. So another was Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., who was killed in an F-104 crash in December of 1967. This happened shortly after he had been selected as a pilot within the United States Air Force's Manned Orbiting Laboratory, which was later canceled in 1969. Thomas Ronald Barron, who was a North American aviation employee, he died in a car crash involving a train on April 27th of 1967. So the crash happened 6 days after he testified before Olin E. Teague's House Subcommittee at NASA oversight hearing held following the Apollo 1 fire, after which he was fired. So, Michael J. Adams and Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., however, had no connection with the civilian crewed space program that oversaw the Apollo missions. Thomas Ronald Barron was a quality control inspector who wrote a report that was critical of the Apollo program and was an outspoken critic of NASA's safety record after the Apollo 1 fire. Barron and his family were killed when their car was struck by a train at a crossing. The deaths were considered an accident. All of the deaths happened at least 20 months before Apollo 11 and subsequent flights, so there would have been no need to kill them to cover up a hoax that had not even taken place yet.
No, fair enough.
Also, the number of deaths within the American astronaut corps is similar to the number of deaths by the Soviets. Next, conspiracists point to the post flight conference for Apollo 11. They point out that there were moments in which the astronauts appeared serious or tired, while the overall press conference was filled with laughter. They claim this shows that the astronauts are feeling guilty about faking the landing. But this supposed evidence can be explained as cherry picking and an appeal to emotion rather than logic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna imagine they probably were tired. Just
Probably.
tired from it, because they were awake and it was probably not just easy. It probably, hard on your body, basically.
Oh, absolutely. So, in June of 1977, NASA issued a fact sheet responding to the claims that the moon landings were hoaxed. The fact sheet is blunt and regards the idea that the moon landings were fake as preposterous and outlandish. They also point out the rocks and particles that were collected from the moon. They claim that these could not have been formed under conditions on Earth. NASA also notes that all of the operations and phases of the Apollo program were closely followed and under the scrutiny of the media from liftoff to splashdown.
Mhm.
Next, we will discuss the supposed involvement of filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick is claimed to have produced much of the footage of the Apollo 11 and 12, presumably because he had just directed 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Right.
The movie was partly set on the moon and featured advanced special effects for that time. It's claimed that NASA approached Kubrick sometime in early 1968 when the film was in post-production and asked him to direct the first 3 moon landings. Supposedly, the launch and splashdown would be real, however, the spacecraft would stay in Earth's orbit and faked footage would be broadcast. There is no evidence to support this claim. The claims also overlook many factors. For example, Kubrick's depiction of the moon's surface in his film differs greatly from the depiction of the Apollo landing.
Right.
Also, the astronauts in the film move differently from the astronauts who reportedly walked on the surface of the moon. Several scenes from the film show dust billowing as the spacecraft landed, something that would not happen in the vacuum environment of the moon. As expected, there has been no evidence ever found to support this theory. In 2002, NASA granted $15,000 to James Oberg to write a point by point rebuttal of the hoax claims. However, NASA canceled the commission later that year after complaints that the book would dignify the accusations.
I can see that.
Yeah. Oberg later said that the belief in the hoax theories was not the fault of the conspiracists, but rather that of teachers and people who should provide information to the public, especially NASA.
True.
An episode of Mythbusters in August of 2008 was dedicated to the moon landings. The Mythbusters crew tested many of the conspiracists' claims. Some of the tests were done in a NASA training facility. All of the claims that were examined on the show were labeled as busted or disproved.
Right.
Conspiracists also claimed that observatories and the Hubble Space Telescope should be able to photograph the landing site. This implies that the world's major observatories are complicit in the hoax by refusing to take photos of the landing sites. However, photos of the moon have been taken by Hubble, including at least 2 Apollo landing sites. But the Hubble resolution limits make it impossible to see any landing site features.
I could see that.
Yeah. In April of 2001, Leonard David published an article on space.com which showed a photo taken by the Clementine mission showing a diffuse dark spot at the site NASA claims is the landing site for the Apollo 15 lander.
Mm-hmm.
Also, in 2002, Alex R. Blackwell of the University of Hawaii pointed out that some of the photos taken by the Apollo astronauts while in orbit around the moon showed the landing sites.
Right.
The Japanese Aerospace Exploration, also known as JAXA, JAXA, launched its Selene moon orbiter in September of 2007. It orbited the moon at about 100 kilometers or 62 miles altitude. It was later reported in May 2008 that JAXA had detected the halo generated by the Apollo 15 lunar module engine exhaust.
Right.
A 3-dimensional reconstructed photo also matched the terrain of the Apollo 15 photo taken from the surface. On July 17th of 2009, NASA released low-resolution engineering test photos of the Apollo 11, Apollo 14, Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and Apollo 17 landing sites that had been photographed by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter as part of the process of starting its primary mission. The photos show the descent stage of the landers from each mission on the moon's surface. The photo of the Apollo 14 landing site also shows tracks made by an astronaut between the science experiment and the lander. The Apollo program collected 380 kilograms or 838 pounds of moon rocks during the 6 crewed missions. Analysis on these rocks were done by scientists worldwide, and they all agree that rocks came from the moon. There are no published claims in peer-reviewed scientific journals that dispute these claims.
Mhm.
The rocks are different from meteorites and Earth rocks because they show a lack of hydrous alteration products, which means no water was added to the mineral to create it. They also show evidence of having undergone impact events of an airless body, and they have unique geochemical traits. Furthermore, most are more than 200 million years older than the oldest known Earth rocks. They also contain the same traits as the samples that were gathered by the Soviets. Conspiracists argue that Marshall's Space Flight Center director Werner von Braun's trip to Antarctica in 1967, which was approximately 2 years before the Apollo 11 launch, was to gather lunar meteorites that would be used as fake moon rocks. However, it's now been accepted by the scientific community that the rocks have been blasted from both Martian and lunar surface during the impact events, and that some of these have landed on Earth as meteorites. Also, lunar meteorites are so rare that it would be hard to account for the vast number that were collected. Aside from NASA, several groups and individuals tracked the Apollo missions as they happened. On later missions, NASA released information to the public explaining where and when the spacecraft could be sighted. Their flight paths were tracked using radar, and they were sighted and photographed using telescopes. Also, radio transmissions between the astronauts on the surface and in orbit were independently recorded.
Right.
In a 1994 poll by the Washington Post, 9% of the respondents say that it was possible that astronauts did not go to the moon, and another 5% were unsure. Officials of the Fox network say that skepticism rose to 20% after the February 2001 airing of Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? So what do you think? Were the landings all fake? Was it just the first? What do you think?
Yeah, let us know what you think. Drop us a comment and let us know, because I'm actually interested in what people think about this, because this is a big one that's been around for a while.
Yeah.
And
Hell, I'd say it's probably the biggest conspiracy theory
it's a huge one.
in the States, at
And
least.
like I said, it's one where if you just listen to both sides, you can sort of see where both sides are coming from. I can understand the rebuttal, and I'm not saying that I think it was faked, but I can see why people have questions about some of the things that they've, shown. This is one that's not so outlandish, like we said before, like the reptile people or something, you know what I'm saying. It's not crazy.
It's something I would not put past the U.S. government to pull off.
Well, I wouldn't either.
Because
And-
they've always held their cards from us,
Yeah.
which is their right, and it's honestly smart.
So could I see at least the first one perhaps being faked? Sure. I could. I'm not saying I believe that, because I don't know. I don't really think it was per se, but could I see it? Yeah.
Yeah, personally, I don't think it even matters.
It
Really.
doesn't. I mean, at this point in the game, it doesn't matter. But I'm saying, could I have seen it? Sure. I could see, and I could even see why, because the space race, yada, yada. But, it was just a big thing, and we had to be the first. But anyway, let us know what you think. We're going to continue on with some more conspiracy theories. If you have one that you would like us to cover, drop it in the comments as well. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to stay disturbed.